All right, good morning.
Morning.
New week, Daf Yomi. And we've only got about a week and a few days left of Maseches Zevachim. We will miss you, Maseches Zevachim, but we've still got a little bit more to enjoy. We are sponsored this week by Rabbi Josh and Chana Bernstein in honor of Penny's bar mitzvah upcoming. Mazel tov. And it's going to be beautiful, wonderful, I'm sure. We are at Amar Rabbi Yavohu, which is about 6 lines down from the top on Kuf Zayin Amud Beis. Amar Rabbi Yavohu says, Shachat v'zorak. So now, we had discussed that if you slaughter a korban outside of the Beis HaMikdash of the Azara, if you burn a korban outside of the area of the Beis HaMikdash, we brought the psukim that proved that was in Parak Yud Zayin of Vayikra, from Pasuk Gimel to Pasuk Tes Yud, or that area. And we know that there's prohibitions, a kares prohibition indeed, that if somebody slaughters or burns korbanos, and then we derived also a little bit of a dispute where the source was for the prohibition against throwing blood as well outside of the Beis HaMikdash. And it makes a difference. Rabbi Yavohu says, Shachat v'zorak. If you slaughter and then you throw the blood, l'divrei Rabbi Yishmael, according to Rabbi Yishmael's view, chayav achas, since he learns the pasuk ve'aleihem, that he connects the all other dam yechashev, right? He says dam yechashev. He learns that all of the blood services are connected to the slaughtering. Therefore, the prohibition of throwing the blood comes from the lo saseh related to slaughtering. If you slaughter and throw, and that's it, you're only liable to one thing, because it's basically the same avera. According to Rabbi Akiva, chayav shtayim. According to Rabbi Akiva, he says that it comes from the words ozevach, which is part of the prohibition against burning. So therefore he says throwing the blood is part of the prohibition of burning. So if you slaughter and then you sprinkle, you've actually accomplished slaughtering and burning. So therefore it's two separate averos. Okay, we know that slaughtering and we know that burning are two separate averos. The question is, which one is zrika? Is it part of the slaughtering? Is it part of the burning? If it's part of the slaughtering, if you do slaughter, then Rabbi Yishmael says you're only liable to one. Rabbi Akiva says you're liable to two. Abaye says, "Afilu divrei Rabbi Akiva, I know chayv alachas." Not true. Doesn't really make a practical difference. Abaye says, even according to Rabbi Akiva, you're only going to be violating one prohibition to Amra Kra, because the pasuk says Sham Ta'aseh. That's where you shall do the service. Hakosiv asan kula lekulan avoda achas. The pasuk there, which is referring to burning your olah, is telling us that the rest of the blood services are all one action, regardless of the fact that you might learn zrika from burning. Zrika is really part of all the rest of the services. So therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, burning is going to be one thing, everything else is going to be one thing, and so therefore, if you do slaughtering and you do zrika, throwing the blood, you've really only done one thing. So therefore, even Rabbi Akiva will agree, he suggests, that you're only going to be liable to one thing. Zarak v'hala. Now the other side, let's say you threw the blood and then you burned. L'divrei Rabbi Yishmael, according to Rabbi Yishmael, chayav shtayim. Now that you'd be liable to two, because throwing the blood, according to Rabbi Yishmael, comes from shchita, doesn't come from burning, it comes from slaughtering. L'divrei Rabbi Akiva, according to Rabbi Akiva, chayav alachas. Rabbi Akiva says that the prohibition against throwing the blood comes from the prohibition against burning. Thank you, and therefore you're only be liable to one. Abaye says no. Afilu l'divrei Rabbi Akiva, according to Rabbi Akiva, you're still chayav shtayim. You're still going to be liable to two. Why? Lahaki paginu kra sham ta'alev sham ta'aseh. That's why the pasuk split the two up and said that you're not ever going to be liable to two different actions within burning, despite the fact that the prohibition comes from burning. They're separated. So therefore, even if you did burning and you did throwing the blood, you're still going to be liable to two separate averos, according to Rabbi Akiva. So therefore, also, Rabbi Abai is consistent. No practical difference. Now let's say you did all three, shachat v'zorak v'hala. Let's say you slaughtered, you threw the blood, and then you burned it. L'divrei kol, according to everybody, chayav shtayim, you're only liable to two, because regardless of where you hold that you learned zrika from, you either learned it from shchita or you learned it from burning. You therefore, if you did burning, zrika, and hala, you only have two averos there. Okay, so that's where everybody agrees. Okay, Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis learn. Pasuk says michutz lamachaneh. So the prohibition against slaughtering is outside of the camp. Yochol chutz shalosh machanos. Now we said outside means outside of the Azara, outside of the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash area. We might have thought, based on the fact that Paradum is also brought outside the camp, and there outside the camp means outside of all three camps, so that the prohibition against shchita outside of the Beis HaMikdash only applies outside of all three camps, which would mean you'd only be liable if you slaughtered an animal outside of Yerushalayim. not outside of the courtyard area. Talmud Lomar, therefore the pasuk says, O'ez b'machaneh. Right, the pasuk continues on, and he says, anybody who does the slaughter of a sheep, of an ox or a sheep or a goat outside of the camp. So it's the camp, singular, one camp. So now, iba machane, if it just told me one camp, yachol hashochet ola bedarom, it would just tell me maybe outside of the area that one is supposed to slaughter. And these kodshim are supposed to be slaughtered in the north. Therefore, if you slaughter them in the south, potentially that's outside of its proper place, and you'd be liable for that. Yehechayiv, you'd be liable for slaughtering outside the proper place. Talmud Lomar, therefore the pasuk says, O el michutz lamachane, or to outside of the camp. Machutz lamachane miyuchad she'en roy l'shchitas kodshim l'shchitas kol zevach. Just like when we say outside of the camp, where there we mean outside of all three camps, that's definitely a place that you can't slaughter any offering. So therefore, also the prohibition against slaughtering outside of the single camp also must be a place where you can't slaughter any offerings. Yata Darum, that would exclude the south part of the Beis HaMikdash courtyard. Shafal Pishein Roy L'Shchitas Kodshei Kodshim, even though that's not a place that you can slaughter the Kodshei Kodshim offerings, the Chatas, the Olas, and those offerings. Roy L'Shchitas Kodshim Kalim, you can slaughter your individual Shlomim offerings or your Bechor offerings. Those offerings, the Kodshei Kalim, can for sure be slaughtered there. So therefore, if you slaughter your Kodshei Kodshim in the wrong place, in the south, it's invalid, but it's not a prohibition of Shchutei Chutz. It doesn't fall under that prohibition. Amar Ula says, Hashochet al gago shel heichal chayiv. Let's say you slaughter your animal on the roof of the Beis HaMikdash. Okay? So what about that? He says you're liable. Why? Since there's no sacrifices that are supposed to be slaughtered there. Since there are no sacrifices to be slaughtered there, that was our criteria. No sacrifices get slaughtered there, therefore it must be prohibited to slaughter, and it would be a prohibition of shchutei chutz. Okay, Maskif lo Rava. Rava asks the question on him. Im Kain. That's not how the psukim read. He says, if that was true, the pasuk would say, Nichtov krom michutz lamachane. It would just say outside of the camps, indicating outside of an area that you're allowed to slaughter. V'lo boy el pesach o el moed. It wouldn't require the pasuk that says that you are obligated, that you are violating a prohibition, that you didn't bring it to the Oel Moed. The pasuk says El Pesach Oel Moed Lo Hivio. The prohibition is because you did not bring it to the opening of the Beis Hamikdash. Here, El Pesach Oel Moed Lamali. Why do you need that pasuk? Lav Lumuute Gago. Isn't that telling me that if I brought it to the roof of the Beis Hamikdash, since I'm inside of the opening of the Beis Hamikdash area, inside the Azara, so then that's not a prohibition of Shchutei Chutz. So therefore, he disagrees with Ula. Ula again says that slaughtering it on the roof, you're chayav shchutei chutz, and says Rava, not so. Ula Rava, now according to Rava's explanation, im kain nichtov el pesach o emoed b'machne michutz lamali. If Rava is correct, the only criteria the pasuk needs to tell me is that you didn't bring it to the opening of the Beis Hamikdash. Why does it have to say outside of the camps? Right? Once you tell me that even inside of the courtyard, but on the roof is prohibited, for sure outside of the courtyards is prohibited. Lav la suye gago, isn't that outside of the camps coming to include, to tell me also the roof? Amar Rav Mari says, la suye kula bifnim v'tzavara bachutz. So what we're dealing with here is where the entire animal is inside the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash and the neck of the animal is outside. Because then in that circumstance, you might have thought, hey, it's satisfied the requirement. Like you said, it's bifnim, it's inside of the heichal. So therefore, just like the roof is also okay because it's inside the Azara. Just like the roof is inside the Azara, so too if the animal is inside the Azara, you should be fine. Therefore, the pasuk tells me, no, if it's outside, it's no good. Yeah, well, pshita, if the shchita is being done outside of the Azara, who cares where the rest of the animal is? Amai kaped rachmana, what is it the Torah really cares about? Shchita. The Torah doesn't care where the animal is. The Torah cares where the shchita is. Ushchita bachutzi. And this shchita is outside of the Azara. So therefore, it didn't come in. So therefore, even according to Rava, that wouldn't be acceptable. Ella. Rather, we're dealing with a circumstance where the entire animal is outside, but the neck is inside. In that circumstance, you might have thought, hey, the shechita is where it's supposed to be. Therefore, the pasuk comes to tell me, no, it's outside. Since the animal is outside in a place that it cannot be, that's going to be a shchutei chutz problem. But, says Rava, that those words michutz lamachne don't come to exclude the roof of the Beis Hamikdash. Therefore, he says the roof of the Beis Hamikdash is not a prohibition like Ula suggests.
Is the roof an accessible place, or is this a hypothetical?
It is accessible. I don't know how an animal would be accessing it, because from what I recall, and we'll learn it in Maseches Midos, there are ladders to get up there. And as far as I recall,
monkeys could come up there.
But monkeys are not kosher for korbanos. So we're really talking about oxen, sheep, and goats. Theoretically, one could carry a bird, right? You could definitely carry a bird up there. You could definitely carry, I think you could carry a goat or a sheep up to the roof, theoretically, in a backpack, specially designed, like a pet carrier kind of a situation. I suppose you could, right? That's right. Itmar. So it has been said, Hamale bizman hazeh. Okay, what about nowadays? There's no Beis Hamikdash. If you do slaughtering, if you go to your backyard and you do shchita l'shem korban, are you chayiv kares for shchita b'chutz? So, hamala bezman hazeh. What if you burn a korban? Right? Bezman hazeh. Rabbi Yochanan says chayiv. You are liable nowadays. Reish Lakish Amar Potter. Reish Lakish says no. What is that dependent on? Rabbi Yochanan Amar chayiv. Rabbi Yochanan says you're liable. Why? Because kedusha rishona kidshel l'shasa, the kidshel l'asad lavo. The Beis Hamikdash area is not only holy, wasn't only sanctified at that time, it continues to remain sanctified. Therefore, based on the fact that it's still sanctified, slaughtering outside of the location of the Beis Hamikdash remains prohibited. And therefore, you're liable if you do it. Reish Lakish disagrees. He says, Potter, you're exempt because Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Shas Velo Kitchel Asid Lavo. It was only sanctified at that time. It's no longer continuing to be sanctified. Therefore, in absence of an existing Beis Hamikdash in a location that's sanctified for such, we're back to the old days when there was no official place to bring korbanos, and therefore bringing a korban bisman hazeh on a bama would not be shchutei chutz, would not be a problem. Would
this be an opinion that people rely on to walk up to Har HaBayis?
Well, yes. The only thing is that even people who walk up to the Har HaBayis don't walk up to the Makom HaMikdash. They stay out of the area of the Azara. Because remember that the prohibition, as we learned, the prohibition of coming into the Azara, the prohibition of coming in while you're tummy is in the Azara. Being in the Machane Leviyah is not, as we had discussed when we talked about the person who had tzaras, right? He would stand outside in the Ezras Nashim area and stick his hands in, stick the parts of his body in. So therefore, those people who go up to Har HaBayis go to the mikvah and then go up to Har HaBayis and stay out of the area that they understand to be the area where the Azara was, right? So they don't go, nobody goes to the Dome of the Rock to visit, I hope.
Except for the Muslims.
Right, the Muslims, right? But they're not tameh, they have other problems, but the tumah is not their problem. So that's according to those frum people that are going up and doing this, that's their rationale. I don't think, because I don't believe we hold. That's the theory. That's the current theory. Yes. So the thing is that we hold like Rabbi Yochanan, right? We're posting like Rabbi Yochanan. So don't bring your backyard korbanos, right? Not a good thing to do. Okay. So Nema de plugta de Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yeshua kamiflagi. Let's say the argument between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish is also the other argument between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Ditnan, we learned in a Mishnah. Now the idea of bringing it back a generation it's good because Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan are Amoraim, and now we're going to bring it back and say this argument really existed earlier during the times of the Mishnah as well. Amar Rabbi Eliezer says, Kishayu bonim behechal, when they were reconstructing during Ezra's time, when they were reconstructing the second Beis Hamikdash, hayu osim kloim behechal, they made curtains around the area where they were building and constructing the Beis Hamikdash. Kloim ba'azaros, and they made curtains around the area where they were constructing the courtyards. Except where the curtains were as important. They made the curtains on the inner boundary of the Heichal so that the builders were constructing outside of the Beis Hamikdash, and they were not entering the area of the Beis Hamikdash to do the work, right? So they put the curtains up and then they built on the outside of the curtains. But when it came to the Azara, Bonami Befnim, they could sanctify themselves, become pure, but there wasn't a prohibition against a non-Kohen going in. There wasn't prohibitions against going inside, so therefore they built on the inside of the curtains. Amar Rabbi Yeshua says, Shamati shayu makrivin afal pi she'ein bayis. He says, I heard that they could bring korbanos even though there was no Beis Hamikdash, indicating that he held that there was the kedusha was only temporary, and so therefore it seems like there's there's a disagreement there, right? One says that there was Kedusha, and therefore that's why they were being so careful, as they hadn't built the Beis HaMikdash yet, but they're being careful not to go into the area where the Beis HaMikdash would be. That seems to imply that there was Kedusha, and Rabbi Yeshua is saying, well, they're bringing Korbanos, even when there was no Beis HaMikdash, implies that there was no Kedusha. V'ochim kodshei kodshim, and then they ate kodshei kodshim, af al pi she'en kilayim, even though they had no curtains, they were able to eat kodshei kodshim. Kodshim kalim u'maiser sheni, and they were eating kodshei kalim and maiser sheni, which have to be eaten inside of Yerushalayim, af al pi she'en choma, even though there was no wall built around Yerushalayim at that point. Mipnei, why? Shekedusha rishona kitchel shas v'kitchel asid lavo. So he says because the kedusha was both at that time and in the future. Now I seem to have confused myself because that would be backwards. Oh, I see what he's saying. He's saying not they didn't bring the korbanos outside. They brought the korbanos in the Azara. Despite the fact that there was no Beis HaMikdash standing, and despite there were no walls around Yerushalayim, everyone was only bringing korbanos in the Beis HaMikdash area, and they were eating their korbanos, their kodshim kalim, inside Yerushalayim, despite the fact that there was no walls. Now, if there's no walls and there's no Beis HaMikdash building, why are you still bringing korbanos inside the Beis HaMikdash? The answer is because it was all sanctified. Okay, so it was all sanctified.
The land, like the area.
The whole area was sanctified and remains sanctified, right? So they're both there. So therefore, according to him, so he's saying that it was sanctified. Now, if he's suggesting that it was all sanctified, Lav Mikal Rabbi Eliezer Savar Lo Kidsha, he's arguing, right? He's the second opinion. So if the second opinion is that the whole Beis HaMikdash area remained sanctified, that means Rabbi Eliezer, who's talking about the curtains, is suggesting that it wasn't sanctified. So of course we're going to ask, well, then why put up the curtains and why are you building on the outside versus the inside if it's not sanctified? We'll get there in a second. Samar le Ravina le Ravashi. Ravina says to Ravashi, Mimai, who says that? Dilma de Kuliyama Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Shasa v'Kitchel Asalevo. Maybe everyone agrees with Rabbi Yochanan, or Rabbi Yochanan agrees with both sides. And really, the Kedusha is eternal. Umar Maidishmia Leikamar, Maidishmia Leikamar, and they're just agreeing with each other. They're just both teaching what they had heard. One said, you know how I know that the Kedusha was established? Was because they put up curtains and they were not going into the area where they shouldn't be. And the other one says, you know how I know that the Kedusha is still established? Because they were bringing korbanos and they didn't even have the walls of the Beis HaMikdash put up. But they're both agreeing with each other on that point. And if you're going to ask, Kilayim le Rabbi Eliezer lamali, what would be the point if there was no Kedusha to Rabbi Eliezer putting up the curtains? Why would they be putting up the curtains? The answer is, Litzniu Sabiyama. It's just not nice for the Beis HaMikdash. Here you're doing korbanos and sacrifices and services and have everything exposed. So as they were building, they put curtains up in order to be able to, in order to make it so.
Was it mechitza was like a mechitza?
Sorry, yeah, mechitza was the curtains were like a mechitza. That's right.
Similarly, at Eitz Chaim, there's a big sort of cover.
That's exactly what it's like. The Beis HaMikdash and Eitz Chaim exactly parallel.
In the front.
That's correct. We're building on the inside, right?
Yep.
Keep the riffraff out. So that's it. So Rabbi Eliezer. So the idea is that that we had thought that we had to put up the curtains in order to sanctify it. Right? That was what the purpose of the curtains were. We were sanctifying by putting up the curtains. No, we're not. We're not sanctifying to put up the curtains. We're only putting up the curtains for privacy's sake. And therefore he agrees with Rabbi Yeshua that it was all sanctified. And that seems like our Gemara comes to the conclusion like Rabbi Yochanan, and that everything is sanctified, which is why nobody's bringing backyard korbanos nowadays. Okay. Itmar. Furthermore on what we have been discussing. Hamale ve'ein bo kazayis. Let's say you're burning outside of the area of the Beis HaMikdash. You're burning outside of the Azara. And it's prohibited. But we said you have to burn at least a kazayis. We're going to see actually other potential rules. An olive's amount, right? But ve'ein bo kazayis, there isn't a kazayis amount. So, ve'etzem mashlimo. And now you need a bone fragment completes it. Now we had learned bone fragments were not prohibited, not really part of the korban. If a bone was separated from the rest of the korban, there's no prohibition of me'ilah. But this is attached to the meat now. So Rabbi Yochanan says you're chayav because the meat and the bone are all part of a single entity. And therefore, even despite the fact that bone by itself isn't significant, bone together with meat is a single entity. They combine to form a kazayas, and you're liable. Reish Lakish Amar Potter. Reish Lakish is not true. Bone is not eligible for the prohibition, and therefore, if you have meat attached to bone and you don't have a kazayas of meat, the bone does not fill in the requirement.
Is there I guess we'll see, but is there a requirement of rove that the meat portion has to be bigger?
It does not seem to indicate that, right? That's a good point, right? It just seems to be that once the bone is attached to the meat, it's considered meat. That's what it sounds like, right? There doesn't sound like it needs to be a rove. That's a good question. I guarantee somebody talks about that.
But meat also would be maybe the ikr.
Correct. The meat, because maybe the meat is the ikr of that bone, even if it's in a smaller amount, right? That could be. That's a great point, because they don't mention that. Let's see if he brings it up. No, I don't see anything here so quick. Okay, so let's presume you don't even need it to be rove, and it's because it's the ikr, right? The main point is the meat. Okay, now Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayev. Rabbi Yochanan says you're liable. Why? Because chiburi olin ka'olin. That which is attached to the ola is like the ola, goes along with it. Ka'olin dami, and Reish Lakish Amar Potter chiburi olin lav ka'olin damu. That which is attached to the ola is not like the ola. Boy Rava asked the following question in the same vein. Hamale Rosh ben Yonah. He's got the head of a dove. Okay, she'en bo kazayas. It's too small. It doesn't have a kazayas. Umalach. Now, you have to dip it in salt. Everything that goes up there has to be dipped in salt. After you dip it in salt, umashlim kazayas. Now you've got a kazayas. The head plus the salt equals a kazayas. So mahu, what happens there? Amarle Rava. So therefore, Amarle Rava mi parzakya l'Ravashi. So Rava from Parzakya sounds like he's not the same Rava that we normally discuss. Says to Ravashi, Lav hainu pluksayu de Rabbi Yochanan of Reish Lakish. Isn't that the same thing that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish argued about? It's an attachment to the ola. So if it's according to Rabbi Yochanan, if it's attached, it's considered attached, and Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lakish says it's not. So no. We're not really sure that it follows the same procedures as the bone and the meat, and therefore it's an argument according to Reish Lakish or according to Rabbi Yochanan. It's a question according to Rabbi Yochanan because Ad Kan Lo Kama Rabbi Yochanan Hosam Ela Etzem. Rabbi Yochanan only says that over there because he's talking about a bone, Demina de Basar, because that's the same type as meat. Bone and meat are both animal. Aval Melech, but the salt, Delav Mina, is not the same type. So therefore, Delav Mina Debar Yonah, it's not the same type as the head of the bird. Delav Debar Mina, I'm not reading right. Delav Mina Debar Yonahu. So Lo Tiboy. So therefore, you don't. It's not. That's not even a question according to Rabbi Yochanan. You wouldn't include it. Reish Lakish. So Lo Tiboy Reish Lakish, and of course, according to Reish Lakish, for sure it's not connected, right? It's salt. He didn't even include bone. Ad kan lo kama Reish Lakish hosam ela dei porish mine lav mitzvah lasuke. He says, you know what though? When it comes to bone, maybe that's where Reish Lakish draws the line and says those are two different things. Why? Because if we had learned that if you put meat and bone on the mizbeach to burn and the bone pops out, you don't need to put it back because the bone doesn't go back up. Aval hacha, but
the bone pops out. Doesn't it have a move because it's a broken bone?
It's already burned, right? We're already dealing with the situation where it's in the fire already. We've already slaughtered it. It's already been chopped up. Yeah, there's no moment here anymore. So aval hacha, but here di parish mitzvah lasuke. If the bird's head pops out, you got to salt it again and put it back up. So therefore he wouldn't agree that it isn't attached. The requirement to put the salt back is there. So therefore, maybe he would say it is attached. Or maybe it doesn't matter. So teku. So we don't know what the rule is there, what Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan would hold by the salt. Not necessarily a connected machlokas. Then we have Rabbi Yossi Aglili in our Mishnah. Back to our Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says that if you did shchita inside and then you brought it outside, then you're liable, but if you did the slaughtering outside and you burned it outside, you would not be liable because by slaughtering it outside, you've already invalidated the meat. So what good is it to burn it outside? It's irrelevant. To which the Rabbanan said to him, that's always the case. If you slaughtered it inside, then you bring it outside. As soon as you bring it outside, it's invalid. Therefore, you were bringing invalid meat on the outside and you're still liable. So therefore, what are you talking about? So Heishiv Rebbe Tachas Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So Rebbe gives an answer for Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Right? He says, I'll tell you why it's different. Mala shochit pnim. If you slaughter it inside, umala b'chutz, and then you burn it outside, shaisel shasa kosher. For a moment, it was valid. Right? Tomar b'shochit chutz. But if you slaughtered it outside, umala b'chutz, and you burned it outside, shaisel shasa kosher, was never valid. It was immediately invalid. So that's a big difference, right? So therefore, that's what Rabbi Yossi says. If it was valid for a second, you slaughtered it inside, everything was going well, and then you brought it outside, now it's invalid, fine. If you bring it on the Mizbeach, it's no good. Why? Because it was valid at some point. But if you did the Shechita and immediately it was invalid, so then that's where you're not liable outside. Hey, sure, Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon, Tachas, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon, he also gives an answer to answer up Rabbi Yossi Agli, and he says, Mala shochet pnimu mala b'chutz shekain kodesh mekablo. Remember the old rules that if you invalidated some things, if you did the slaughtering on the inside, you invalidated them. They could still be, if they were brought on the base on the mizbeach, you don't take it down. Well, one of them was something that goes chutz lazara. If you had kosher korban meat and you brought it outside of the courtyard area, if you brought it back in and put it on the base on the mizbeach, you don't take it down. So this meat that you slaughtered inside would have that rule. But because why? Because the psul was inside the azara. It became invalidated because of something that happened inside the azara. However, if you slaughtered it outside of the azara, if you brought it in, you couldn't put that. If you put it up in the mizbeach, you'd have to take it down. Because Tomar b'shochit b'chutz, if you slaughtered it outside, she'ein kodesh mekablo, the mizbeach wouldn't accept it. So that's different. The inner mizbeach still accepts it. That's why it has an elevated level of kedusha, and you're liable if you bring it outside. My beinahu, what's the practical difference? Is there a case between these two different answers? Yeah. Amar Zira says, Shchitas laila ike beinahu. What if you slaughter an animal at night? If you slaughter it at night, it's never valid. So therefore, according to the opinions, it's never valid. If you burn it outside, it's not going to be a problem. But remember that we had, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Lazar's opinion, it was actually a machlokas, Rabbi Shimon ben Lazar and Rabbi Yehuda, whether we held which way we held. But according to Rabbi Shimon ben Lazar's opinion, in the Mishnah we had about 20 days ago or so, that slaughtering at night, if you bring it up in the mizbeach, you don't take it down. So therefore, that is still going to be a violation if you bring it outside, according to his opinion. Rabbi Amar says, I'll give you a different one. Keep kabla bekli cholik. Another circumstance is also like this. What if I slaughter it by catch it in a non-service utensil? So I catch the blood in a non-service utensil, it was never valid. Therefore, if I burn it outside, it would not be valid. But it's only a psul that happens inside the kodesh. It happens inside the azara. Therefore, it has kedusha, and therefore, if I bring the meat outside, I would be liable. So therefore, that's another circumstance of distinction. Okay, next then they said, well, wait a second, let's give you another example of this. We had somebody who was tameh, she'achal bein kodesh, somebody who's tameh, and then he eats meat that became tameh as well. So we had the discussion, is it another violation or is it? So their point to him was, the Rabbanah's point to Rabbi Yossi Gili is, fine, if he's tameh, as soon as he touches the meat becomes tameh. There's never, of course he's going to be, because it touches the meat, it becomes tameh. There's never a circumstance where somebody who's tameh would eat meat that isn't tameh. So Shapir Kamri lay Rabbanan Rabbi Yossi Gili. That Rabbanan are giving a very valid point, right? There's never a circumstance where somebody who's tameh is eating tahor meat. It's always going to be tameh as soon as he touches it. Amar Rava says, Kol hecha de nitma tumas haguf yachar kach nitma basar de kuli amadol pligi dechayev. Okay, you're right. Nobody disputes the fact that if the person was tameh first, and then afterwards the meat became tameh, that there would be a chi of kares there. There would be a kares. Why? That's obviously the way the Torah says. The Torah says that somebody has tumas haguf who eats meat that's a korban, he's chai of kares. And as we said, there's never a circumstance where he could ever eat something that the meat didn't become tameh. So that is the circumstance by definition. Therefore, nobody disputes that. Rabbi Yossi Gili is saying, yeah, I agree with you. If you touch it and it becomes tameh, then you're right. He's chayiv kares. Even if he doesn't, even if the guy is tameh and the meat becomes tameh some other way, I agree with you. If you eat that, you're tameh. Shekain tumas haguf bekares, because tumas haguf is a kares prohibition. Ki pligi, the argument is beshenitma basar. What if the meat became tameh first? V'yachar kach nitma haguf, and then he gets tumas haguf. That's where they're going to argue. Okay? De Rabbanan Savri Amrin on Migo. Rabbanan Savar hold of something called Isser bechlolos, or a lot, whether you can add a prohibition on top of another prohibition, and under what circumstances. Okay, so this meat was already tamei. So for this person to eat this meat, it already is prohibited. Now he becomes tamei further. Now what happens? Since he becomes tamei further, all meat of all korbanos becomes prohibited to him. That adds on, since more things become prohibited to him, that prohibition level, he becomes tumas haguf. Therefore, when he eats the meat that was already prohibited to him, he can be chayav kares, because he's chayav kares for eating all the other pieces of meat that were permitted to him before, right? This one was tamei, so there was no kares if he ate that one. This one was tahor, this one was tahor, this one was tahor. Fine, but now that he becomes tamei, this one that was tahor is now an isser kares, this one is an isser kares, this one is isser kares. Since all of these become an isser kares, the one that was a los hasedim also becomes an isser kares. That's the way the Rabbanon hold. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Savar Lo Amrin Amigo. The Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, no, once something is prohibited, you can't make it more prohibited. This one was tahor, so therefore it becomes a prohibition of kares if he eats it. This one was tahor, therefore, but this one that was already prohibited to him, okay, fine, he's now an elevated, he's also tamei. Who cares? That's not relevant. He was already this was already usher to him. You can't have a changed level of prohibition. Therefore, if he eats this one, it's only a lo saseh.
People see it really bad for
The rules are things like, for example, eating something that's non-kosher on Yom Kippur. Right? This is where lav shebechlolos comes in, right? Where I had food that was not kosher, I can't eat it. Now comes Yom Kippur. Now I can't eat any food. Since I can't eat any food, if I eat non-kosher food, it's a lav shebechlolos. The prohibition against eating on Yom Kippur goes on to this already prohibited item.
If you're eating on Yom
And I can get kares for eating on Yom Kippur.
It's double. It's a double.
Yeah. So then, therefore, that's where this lav shebechlolos comes in. Something that was already prohibited, but now my prohibition includes other items that were previously permitted. That's where the lav shebechlolos comes in. Okay.
I was going to ask you. So if you eat on Yom Kippur, is like you can be chayav misa if you eat on Yom Kippur?
I think that it's a chiv kares, not a chiv misa spaced din, if I'm not mistaken. That's sort of something that I don't know why. Like, it slips your mind when you're not thinking about it. I'm in korbanos now, but the answer is I think so. I'm going to double check that, but yeah. Okay, Rabbi Yossi nehi demigo lo amrinon. Okay, but fine, Rabbi Yossi. I understand that you don't add and say, well, since you're prohibited to all these previously permitted meats, you're also going to be prohibited in an elevated way to this one. Tesi tumas haguf de chamira v'tachol tumas basar. Why don't you just say, well, you did have a lo saseh. You had a lo saseh for eating this meat because you were tahor and the meat was tamei. Now that you are tamei, doesn't that elevate you to an isser of kares? Shouldn't that be the rule? Because it's a stricter level. So Amar Rav Ashi, Rav says, mimayde tumas haguf chamura. How do you know that the tumas haguf is more stringent? Why? Because it's kares? Yeah, but I'll show you how the tuma of the meat, which was a lo saseh, actually is more strict. Dilma tumas basar chamura. Maybe the meat restriction was more strict. Shekain ein lo tahara b'mikvah, because you can't dip the meat in a mikvah and make it tahor now. A person can go to the mikvah and become tahor. So therefore, the person is really the less strict thing. So therefore, to say that he's now chayav kares for eating because he's done the more strict thing, not necessarily. Him being tamei isn't necessarily more strict. So therefore, we don't add that on. Okay. Says the next Mishnah. Chomer b'shchita mi ba'aliyah. You know what's stricter about slaughtering outside the Beis Hamikdash? We said both of them are prohibited. But there's circumstances where if you slaughter, you're liable, but if you do similar things by burning it, you're not liable. Uba'aliyah mi b'shchita. Similarly, there are certain things that if you do them by burning, that if you did the same thing by shchita, you wouldn't be liable. Chomer b'shchita, you know what the stringency of slaughtering is? Shashochet lehed yod chayav. If you slaughter for the sake of a person, let's say somebody wants lunch, right? If I slaughter a korban outside of the Beis Hamikdash for the sake of somebody, a person, I'm almost like for the sake of maybe a avodah zarah, maybe you're worshiping him, but you're slaughtering it for he wants meat, he wants to eat it. So then you'd be chayav for slaughtering the korban outside of the Beis Hamikdash. And hamaleh lehedyot potter. But let's say you burn a korban for the sake of worshiping a person, that's avodah zarah. But it's not a prohibition against doing a korban, burning a korban outside, because it's not a korban anymore. You do it for a person. Chomer ba'aliyah, here's the stringency about burning, which is that shnaim she'achzu besakin v'shachtu pturim. If two people hold the knife while they're doing the slaughtering, then that's not a slaughtering. It's not, you're not liable. However, achzu be'ever v'helu chayavim. But if two people grab the limb and they throw it into the fire, the two people are liable. So therefore, that's a stringency by burning. Hella, let's say he puts up some meat on his outside mizbeach. Chazer v'helu, then he goes back and he puts more on. V'chazer v'helu, he puts more on. Chayav al aliyah. He's liable for every time he puts more meat on. Divrei Rabbi Shimon says. Now we're going to try to figure out what the circumstances are. Rabbi Yossi says, "Eino chayav elachas." No, if he puts more meat on and more meat on and more meat, it's only one prohibition. Ve'eino chayav ad sheyalu l'rosh hamizbeach. You're only liable if he brings it to the top of a mizbeach. He needs to build an altar, and he needs to burn his korban on an altar. Rabbi Shimon says, "Afilu halasela o al even chayav." Even if you just take a rock or a stone, right? And the Mefarshim explain at least 10 tvachim off the ground, so he's like this high off the ground. That's enough. You can declare this to be your mizbeach, and that is enough to burn it on that, and you're liable. Says the Gemara, Maishna hamale lehedyot de potter. Why is it that if you burn it for a person, you're going to be not liable? It's all going to be based on the psukim now. So we're going to go back and forth in psukim quickly in a technical piece. Why is a hedyot? Why is it that if somebody burns it for a person, you're not liable? Dichsiv, because the pasuk says la Hashem. Pasuk says you have to burn it for Hashem. You're burning for a person, not burning it for Hashem. You're not liable. B'shchitanami yaksiv la Hashem, but also by slaughtering it says that it has to be done for Hashem. Shani Halsam, that's different. We already used that pasuk. Damar Kro, the pasuk says ish. It says each man, meaning gabe hal. So therefore, each man tells me that even if you slaughter it for a person, you're also liable. Yeah, but ha'ala, and we're going to say, what do we need Hashem for? We're going to save that question for the end. But gabi ha'ala nami ksiv. Well, but the problem is by burning it also says each man. Yeah, but we need that pasuk because l'shnaim she'alu be'aver. That's to tell me each man who carries, if two people carry up the limb and they burn it on the mizbeach, that both of them are liable. Then why isn't it that it says ish? Why don't we use it the same way when it comes to slaughtering and say the two people who are holding the knife are liable? We said they're not. Shani Halsam, that's different by the slaughtering because Damar Cross, the pasuk says hahu echad v'lo shnaim. It uses the word him. He's liable, singular, which means it's not liable for two people. So we couldn't interpret ish to mean two people. Well, if that's true, gabi holanami aksiv ahu. By the burning, it also says ahu. So he says, yeah, but we need that pasuk because lemute shogeg onus umuta. What if somebody does it b'shogeg, right? He makes a mistake, right? He doesn't think that bamos are prohibited. He didn't know that, or he's onus, right? He thinks that it's permissible completely. He's completely mistaken, or mutar. Somebody fools him, and he thinks somebody told him, right? Somebody told him, hey, yeah, you can do that. Okay, so in those circumstances, you're not liable. Kares. If that's true, so if that's true, if that was what you use hahu for, so then also by the shchita, why doesn't it tell? Where do I know that you're not liable if you are mistaken? So trei hahu ksivi, the word hahu is written twice by shchita, and then everything else falls into place by dominoes. So fine. I understand why I can't interpret La Hashem for the sake of Hashem and not for a person by the Shechita. But what do I use La Hashem for when it comes to Shechita? Lo tzisir mishtalech, to tell me that if somebody slaughters the goat that was sent out on Yom Kippur, which is not a korban for Hashem, since it's not for Hashem, you're not liable. So if somebody does the Shechita b'chutz of the Sir Mishtalech of Yom Kippur, the goat that gets sent to Azazel, you're not liable for Shechita chutz in that case, because it's not a korban.
Right.
Next, chomer b'hala. You know what the stringency by burning is? The stringency is that two people who bring it up are liable. Tana Rabban ish. Right? It says ish. Ma tamar lomer. Why does it tell me man twice? L'rabo shnayim, to tell me two men. Shachsu be'aver v'halu shachayovin. Right? Two men bring up the limb. They are liable. Shiyachol, because I might have thought v'alo dinhu that there's a kal v'chomer here. Uma shochet lehedyot shechayiv shnayim she'achsu b'sakim shachtu pturin. If when it comes to shchita, that's the strict case. Even if I slaughter for the sake of a person, I'm liable. And And nevertheless, I'd be exempt if I had two people holding the knife. If somebody burns for the sake of a person, you're exempt. For sure, if two people carry the limb, they should be exempt. So Talmud Lomar, therefore it says, ish. The Pasuk specifically tells me, no, ish, two men are liable. Divrei Rabbi Shimon, that's how Rabbi Shimon learns it. Rabbi Yossi says, hahu echad velo shnayim. It says, hahu, the word hahu, like we had learned before, the word hahu tells me by the shchita that one person has to do it, not two. Im kain ma Talmud Lomar ish. Then if that's the case, why does it say ish by the shchita? Dibrator koloshim b'nei adam. That's just the way the Torah uses phrases. Sometimes it doesn't mean anything. Don't get confused that it means something. It doesn't. Rabbi Shimon hayahu miboyle lemute shogeg onus mut'a. So Rabbi Shimon says, I need that in order to tell me that as we had learned, hahu teaches me to exclude somebody who is tricked or makes a mistake. Rabbi Yossi me'ahu hahu. He has two times the word hahu. Rabbi Shimon hahu. Not just who, he has who twice, but it says who and an extra hey hahu. So he learns it from both of those things. Rabbi Shimon hu hahu lo darish. Rabbi Shimon says no, that doesn't bother me. Hahu is just the same word. It's the extra hey doesn't bother me. I don't need a drasha for that. Rabbi Yossi midahai ish dibra Torah koloshim b'nei adam hahu ish nami dibra Torah. If that's true, then once you were telling me that the Torah says ish, that's just the normal way that it's talking, that the Torah is just telling me ish. 1 second. I'm going to make sure I know which one is which. Right, he doesn't make a drush ish by the ha'ala, right? So he doesn't use, he says, 1 second, because Rabbi Yossi said ahu means even one person, even if he disagrees with our Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi. I didn't make that clear. Rabbi Yossi disagrees with our Mishnah and says even one person bringing up, only if one person brings it up, if two people bring it up, you're not liable from the fact that it says ish. Now, if that's the case, ish, he says ish doesn't tell me that it needs to be one person, so then why doesn't he say the same thing by the knife and say ish also? It's just the regular way, the way it's talking. It doesn't mean to tell me one person. So ve'ela shochet lehedyot minole dechayev. So ish, if that's true. So how do I know ish? We had used ish by shchita to tell me that somebody who was slaughtering for the sake of a person was liable. Nafkalei midam yechashev leish hahu dam shafach. From the fact that it says that if you slaughter it, then it is considered to be blood for that person, and he spilled blood. Because the pasuk says laish. Person is considered to be blood for that person. So that since that pasuk uses the word laish, it tells me, not from ish like we had thought to say before, but laish tells me that even if one slaughters it for a person, you are liable. Okay, next. Now the Mishnah said that if you burn and then you go back and you burn again, so then you are going to be liable every time. Amar Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish explains, Machlokes, there's going to be three or four. Not sure I remember. 3 or 4 different interpretations of this argument. So, fasten seatbelts. Amar Reish Lakish says, Machlokes bedalad vehei evarim. The argument is, if I've got one animal and I'm putting up 4 or 5 pieces of it, of the same animal. Demar savar kiksiv lasososo. One says, the pasuk tells me you have to do it, meaning the entire animal. You're only liable if you burn the entire animal in shchutei chutz. Now, bringing korbanos inside, you're liable. You are responsible for burning any kazayas. That's just not the case when it comes to shchutei chutz. When it comes to halas chutz, if you're burning it outside, it says lasososo. You got to do the whole animal. Akol behema ksiv. That means you need the entire animal. So therefore, if I bring up part of it, not done. I'm not chayev. I bring up the next part, I'm not done. I'm not chayev. Once I bring up the last piece, then I'm liable. Right? Bring up one, then I bring up another. I'm only chayev one. That's what the Mishnah says. Umar Sarver, the other one says akol ever ve'ever ksiv. When it says that you need the entire thing, it doesn't mean the whole animal. It means the whole limb, the whole piece. Aval ever echa divrei akol eno chayev ela achas. Right? So if you bring the last limb, you're only going to be liable right? If you brought the last limb, you're only going to be liable one. So that means that if you brought, so according to one opinion, you bring limb, each time you're chayiv. Then you bring the last one, then according to both opinions, you're chayiv for the last one. Why? Because the last one, you're bringing the entire animal. And according to the shita that you're liable for every one, you're also liable for that limb. That's where the argument is. That's opinion number one. For Rabbi Yochanan says, no, machlokas be'ever echad. The argument is within one limb. Demar savar mukdre pnim shechasru v'halo b'chutz chayev. So he says, one of them says, what if you do shchita inside the azara? If you do shchita inside the azara, every kazayas has to be burned on the mizbeach. It's a mitzvah for each one. Therefore, every kazayas that you burn outside, you're chayev. Therefore, if you bring part of the limb, you're chayev. You bring part of the limb again, you're chayev. Part of the limb, you're chayev. Marsav, the other one says, potter, that you're exempt until you bring the entire limb. It says la so, you have to do it. You have to bring the entire thing. Aval, however, bedalad v'heivarin, if you bring 4 or 5 limbs, divrei akol chayev akol ever vever. According to Rabbi Yochanan, if you bring 4 or 5 limbs to make up the whole animal, you're going to be liable 4 or 5 times because each limb for sure is chayev. It was only a question about parts of limbs. Upliga de Ula. Both of those views argue against Ula's view. Ula's view number 3. Damar Ula says, Hakol modim be muktere pnim shechasru v'halu b'chutz shechayev. Everyone agrees that if you did the slaughtering inside, right, and then you brought it outside, you'd be liable. V'lo nechlaku el b'mekutre chutz. The argument is only not like Rabbi Yochanan said. The argument is now whether you bring a kazayas, doesn't matter where it was brought. Since we learned that a kazayas is going to be activated if you slaughtered it inside, even if you do it outside, it's also a problem. No, not so, Ula says. Only if you slaughtered it inside does a kazayas become a problem. So therefore, they agree that if you bring up any kazayas from something you slaughtered inside, you're going to be liable. The question is, you slaughtered this outside. So since I slaughtered it outside, that's where their argument is. So if you slaughtered it outside, and now you've got a little bit missing, that's their argument. Demar Savar Potter, one says, you're exempt. This isn't a piece of meat that was ever activated by the Mizbeach inside, so therefore it needs to be the whole thing. Umar Savar Chayev, the other one says, no, it follows the same rules. Inside, outside follow the same rules. If inside it would be a problem, then if you slaughtered it outside, it's the same problem, and every kazayas is going to be a problem. That's how we learned Ula. But Ikadamri, but there are those who learned Ula differently. Amar Ula says, Hakol modim, everyone agrees, b'mekutre chutz, shechasr v'ala b'chutz, shu potter. This side says, no, the opposite. Everyone agrees that if you slaughtered it outside, that every kazayas wouldn't be a problem. You need to bring the entire limb. They're arguing about if it was slaughtered inside, and then you bring one kazayas out at a time. Demar Savar Potter, one says, you're exempt, because after all, at the end of the day, you're still burning it on the outer mizbeach. It doesn't follow the same rules as the inner mizbeach. The inner mizbeach has a requirement to burn every kazayas, but the outer mizbeach needs the entire limb, and it's not. Umar Sarvar Chayev, the other one says, no. Once you're slaughtering it inside, it gets activated, and it gets treated like a regular korban, just like the regular mizbeach needs every kazayas. So too, if you burn a kazayas outside, you're in violation. Okay, so now, upligi davud shmuel alishna kama de ula. The first version of Ula argues with what Avuha de Shmuel said. Now again, the way that the first version of Ula was that inside it becomes activated according to everybody, right? Everyone agrees that once you slaughter it inside, every kazayas burned outside is going to be a problem. Damar Avuha de Shmuel, but here's what problem with that. Avuha de Shmuel said, Keman mehadrinan pokin legabi mizbeach. Who is it that holds that if a piece of meat that was put on the mizbeach pops out, that you put it back on? Keman delok Rabbi Yossi, not like Rabbi Yossi. Now, why is that a problem? Because Rabbi Yossi said every kazayas, once you slaughter it inside the mizbeach, every kazayas has got to go on the mizbeach, according to everybody. Well, if he's saying that Rabbi Yossi doesn't agree, well, Rabbi Yossi, according to the opinion that says you do it inside, there isn't any opinions that say you don't agree. So Ula, there's no way to understand Avua de Shmuel, according to Ula's explanation of Rabbi Yossi. You have to explain Rabbi Yossi as holding that every kazayas is not important on the inside. Therefore, Rabbi Yossi must be holding that if you took a kazayas and burned it outside, you would not be liable. Because if it fell off the mizbeach, the kazayas fell off, not the entire limb, but a kazayas fell off, you wouldn't need to put it back on. But if you hold that every kazayas needs to go is your chayiv outside, why wouldn't you be responsible for putting it back on the mizbeach? So that's why it doesn't hold like Ula. Okay, next. You're not liable until you bring it up to the top of a mizbeach. That's the question, last part of the Mishnah. Do you need a mizbeach or is a rock okay? So, Amar Rav Huna, my time of the Rabbi Yossi, why is it Rabbi Yossi says that any rock is acceptable? Rabbi Yossi says you need a mizbeach. Rabbi Yossi says you need a mizbeach. Why does he say that? Because the pasuk says, "Vayiven Noach mizbeach laHashem." Noach built a mizbeach. So therefore, what do you need in order to bring a korban? You need a mizbeach. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, my time the Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Yochanan says, you know what Rabbi Shimon's explanation is? The pasuk says, "Vayikach Manoach es gedi ha'ezim v'es hamincha vayal al hatzur laHashem." Manoach, Shimshon's father, right? Right? He is that who he was? Right? Whoa. I think so. He brought a goat and he brought it and his mincha and he brought it onto the rock before Hashem. He didn't have mizbeach. One second. How do you explain the fact that Noach built a mizbeach? Why did he build a mizbeach? He could have just brought a rock. Hahu gova bialma. That was just a nice thing to do, right? Noach was doing things the best way, so he built a nice mizbeach out of it. What about Manoach? Why didn't he need to build a whole mizbeach? That was just for the moment, right? That was just a teaching for the moment. He needed to bring korban very quickly, and so he was allowed to do it on a rock. But that's not generally the way it was done. Or else, maybe the reason why Rabbi Shimon says a rock is the prohibition is for a different reason. Kidatanya was going to Bryce. Rabbi Shimon says, Mizbeach Pesach Oel Moed. Right, pasuk says that you're supposed to bring your korban to the mizbeach by the opening of the Ohel Moed. Mizbeach bebama, you only need a mizbeach in the Ohel Moed. You don't need a mizbeach in a bama. That's why he says it. Lefichach, therefore, hela lasela O11. If you brought it up on a rock or on a stone, chayiv, you'd be liable outside because there's no need. You'd be liable if a bama would be kosher during the old days. Therefore, if you do it nowadays when bamas are prohibited, you'd be liable. So, one second, he said, or what do you mean liable? Yotze, you should say you're yotze, meaning that if you brought a korban on a rock when bamos were permitted, it would be accepted, not you'd be liable, it should be accepted. So, this is what it means. Lefichach b'shas isra bamos, since it would be accepted when bamos were acceptable on a rock, ha'ol alasela o 11, if you brought it on a rock or a stone, chayiv, nowadays when bamos are prohibited, that becomes a problem, right? Whatever would have been acceptable by bamos before becomes a problem now. So you couldn't bring it on a bama.
What's the case of Avraham Avinu, with the korban that he was prepared to bring?
Correct. Does it say that it doesn't? Yeah. Well, I guess the psukim don't specify that he had a mizbeach.
Right.
We need a pasuk that specifies. Boy, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina asks, Keren v'keves v'yasod v'ribua mahu shi'akvu b'bama. According to the opinion that says that you need a mizbeach, do you need a ramp, right? Do you need corners? Do you need a base? Does it need to be square? Are all those are the requirements for a mizbeach? Is that what we're saying? It needs to be an official mizbeach according to all standards? Amar le Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Tanya in Brisa, Karen v'keves v'ribu v'yasod me'akvin bebama gedola ve'in ma'akvin bebama ketana. The answer is yes and no. When bamos were acceptable, we have two types of bamos. We have what's called a bama gedola. That's the community bama. That's the one where we brought all the korbanos tzibur, the community offerings. And you couldn't bring community offerings on an individual bama. And as we're going to learn in a few pages where they set those up and what the circumstances for that was. But an individual's personal bama doesn't require those things. So that's not necessary.
There are no specifications.
No, seems to be no specifications. But it can't be a rock. It's got to be a mizbeach.
Right.
But whatever the difference between a mizbeach and a rock, I guess you need to build it up in some kind. But a rock isn't enough. But says the next Mishnah. It does not matter whether we've got kosher korbanos or Pasul korbanos. Shapsulim bakodesh, but as long as the psul has to be something that was related to happening inside of the azara, because under that circumstance now they're appropriate to be brought on the mizbeach in the sense that you don't bring it on the mizbeach, but if you did, you don't take it down. Ve'krivan b'chutz, if you bring them outside, chayav, you are liable for burning them outside. Hamala kazayas min ha'ola umin ha'imurim b'chutz chayav. If you burn a kazayas from an ola and the fats, then you are liable. What does that mean? That means, obviously, we already learned that if you burn a kazayas, you'd be liable. But this is if you combine a kazayas of meat and a kazayas of the fats together, half a kazayas of each, they're going to combine together. Why? Because in ola everything is burnt. So despite the fact that meat is normally something distinct and separate from in other korbanos, not when it comes to an ola. In an ola, they are the same thing. Okay, we'll go just a little bit further. Tanur Rabbanan. When it says Asher Ya'aleh Ola O Zevach. So prohibition is you cannot burn an ola on the mizbeach outside. So then it says O Zevach or other korbanos. Ainli Ela Ola. So since the pasuk says ola, maybe only an ola is prohibited to be burned outside. Minayin lerabos imuri osham ve'imuri chatas. How do I know it's also prohibited to burn the fats of a chatos or an osham outside? Ve'imuri kachim kachim, or any of the other kachim kachim, ve'imuri kachim kalim, and also the fats of the kachim kalim that also have to be burnt. Talmud lomar zevach. It says zevach, so therefore it includes every korban. Minayin l'rabas hakomitz v'alavona v'aktoras. What about uminchas kohanim? What about mincha offerings? The kemitza, the frankincense that goes on the mincha offerings, or the incense, or the mincha of the kohanim, which is completely burned. Uminchas kohen mashiach, or the korban mincha of the kohen mashiach. V'amenashe shloshos lugin yayin, or somebody's bringing his 3 lug of wine and pouring it in 3 lug of water that are brought on Sukkos. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, "Vel Pesach Ol Moed Lo V'yanu." You didn't bring it to the Ol Moed. Anything that was supposed to be brought to the mizbeach and wasn't Kol Haba LePesach Ol Moed Chayav Nolav B'chutz. You're liable if you bring it outside. V'ein li'ela kachim ksherim. That only applies to kosher korbanos. Minayin l'rabas psulin. How do I know also the non-kosher korbanos? Kigon halon va'yotze va'tamei. Also, like for example, ones we leave overnight, or ones that go outside of the azara, or ones that become tamei shnit shchat chutz, or were slaughtered outside of their time chutz l'mikomo, or outside of their proper place with intent, meaning pigul intent. V'shekiblu psulin, or somebody who is non-kohen caught the blood, v'zarku as damo, or through the blood. V'hanitonin lemata shenosin lemalo, or korbanos that are supposed to put the blood below the line and you put it above the line. V'hanitonin lemalo, or you're supposed to put the blood above the line. Shenosin lemata, and you put it down. V'hanisnin b'chut shenosin lifnim, or blood that was supposed to be put on the outer mizbeach that was put on the inner mizbeach. V'hanisnin bifnim, blood that was supposed to go on the inner mizbeach. Shenosin b'chut, you put it on the outer mizbeach. Upesach v'chatas, or a korban pesach or a korban chatas. Shenosin on shalol lishman, that you did them not for the sake of the korban, and all of these are invalid. Nevertheless, you're chayiv if you burn these outside. Minayin, how do I know mar? Minayin, what do I know? Talmud Lomar, it says, lo yavienu. You did not bring it lasos to do them. Kol ha'makabel b'pesach ol moed chayav olav b'chutz. Anything that if you would bring it in, even though it's nullified, if you brought it on the mizbeach, you would put it up, you wouldn't take it down. You are liable if you bring them outside, Okay, it's a good place to stop.
Perfect. So yeah, some other designs mean how long, right?
Yes.
Yeah, right.